All right. Oh, there we go. So, last week, for those who were here and those who weren't, Steve talked to us about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And we learned that this parable doesn't just teach us about being compassionate and kind, but specifically that we're called to love those who are different from us, even those we might consider enemies. Doing something like loving your enemies takes a lot of courage. One thing about love in the Christian sense is that it's not something you can really do from afar. You can't really do it from a distance. I've talked a lot in various sermons about the way Jesus demonstrates God's love for us. The two main ways being the incarnation and the crucifixion. And in both of these cases, love is a challenging, difficult thing that God in Jesus undertakes. Going from distance to proximity, and then coming right into the midst of us, and then demonstrating that there's nothing, not even the life of his son, that God would not give up for us. So, when we think about loving our neighbor in the way that the parable of the Good Samaritan teaches us, and that including our enemy, and then we think about what love entails, that's a pretty scary thing. It kind of sounds like maybe a big, tall task. And so our passage tonight, we're going to turn to Psalm 121, which is in your bulletin or in Bibles, if you want to pull it out and read along. But this passage tonight is about encouragement. It's about giving us the courage to do that hard kind of love, the real Christian kind of love. It gives us the courage to step out into the world, to embrace even our enemies. And it begins with the words from the verse of the song we just sang. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. Psalm 121 starts in a place of very real fear. The psalm begins, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. And very likely, what the psalmist sees on the mountains are armies, enemy armies on those mountains. The city of Jerusalem sits on a hill. It's a city on a hill. It's got valleys on three sides of it. So it's like a slope downward, and there's valleys on three sides. And then there's more mountains. I mean, mountain is sort of a generous term. Nothing is super tall there. Really big hills. We'll call them mountains just to be kind. So it's kind of a very easily defended city because unless you're coming from the north, which is where you'd put all your defenses right away, you have to go up onto the mountain, and you look scary, right? You're up above the city of Jerusalem, but then you have to go down into the valley and then back up a hill to get to actually attacking the city. So it's pretty easily defended, but while it's relatively safe, it still can be very daunting, very scary to have enemies seemingly surrounding you above you on the mountains as you look out from Jerusalem. And that is probably what the psalmist is referring to when he or she says, I lift my eyes to the mountains. And then that leads to the question, where does my help come from? Because there's armies over everywhere. They're not, help is not coming from those directions. So there's only one place for help to come from, and that would be from the north, which is where the temple sits. The temple sits at the top of that northern slope. If you're sitting in the old city, you're like let's say perhaps that you were King David and you were sitting in your temple, and everything, the rest of Jerusalem, the old city, is below you, kind of going down into the valley. The only thing above you is the temple complex to the north. That's what's to the north above you. And so there's enemies to the east, the west, the south. But to the north, the one place that would be easiest to defend and the one place where help could come from is the temple. And so I think the psalmist, whether it's David or someone else, uses this geography to help paint a picture of God as the only trustworthy source of help and security for us. He's using the geography of the land to help sort of create a metaphor of God as the helper. But really, they're beyond just God as sort of the guard, right? The temple sort of is the last line of defense as well as the place where help could come from. That geography helps us to understand also the primary motif or metaphor that the psalmist uses in Psalm 121, which is that God is a watchman. God is watching over his people. Starting in verse 3 and going through to the end, Psalm 121 tells us 5 times that the Lord is watching over us or watching over Israel, keeping us from harm. And so this relates to the war imagery of the first 2 verses. A watchman is, of course, one of the most important jobs in any army. Without somebody keeping watch, it would be impossible to keep an army safe at night, to be prepared for the enemy's attacks, know where the enemy is. And so that's why the psalmist tells us twice, right away, that the Lord will never slumber or sleep. A watchman who falls asleep isn't just not doing their job. They're putting everyone at risk. But God doesn't ever sleep. God is always a faithful watchman. The psalmist declares over and over again in this psalm that God is watching over us. It's just constantly repeated, basically every verse, starting in verse 3. We're told that God will watch us, and we're kind of given several different separate metaphors from the main one to help us understand in what way that is. God will keep our feet from slipping. So kind of likening God to our fellow traveler who keeps us from taking a wrong turn or a wrong step. It says that God will be our shade, protecting us from both the sun and the moon, sun in the day, the moon at night. Now, I think we sort of intrinsically understand sort of a shade as protection from the sun, right? We all know like sunburn, but being protected from the moon at night is really more about the sense of security that you have being indoors, right? You're sort of safe from the terrors of the night, the things that are out there in the night. So the metaphor is not really about something specific. It's really about, again, day and night, all the time. God never sleeps. God is always watching. God is always watching. That's the main point. Now, one thing we have to stop and say is that the phrase, God is watching, is not usually used in a way that is very reassuring or comforting or meant to give us courage. It's usually the opposite, unfortunately. I think that phrase is probably most often associated with judgmental people who are trying to put the fear of God into us. God's watching. Behave, because God is watching. And so God's watchfulness, the fact that God is always watching, day and night, never sleeps, becomes a symbol of fear and anger instead of one of safety and peace and courage. But Psalm 121 isn't about judgment or anger. And it's true that if you are God's enemy, then God's watchfulness probably isn't great for you. But because of Jesus, none of us are God's enemy. Even if you're somebody who rejects God, or deliberately disobeys God, or makes even just a big mistake, you're not God's enemy anymore. The Bible is clear that God comes running after you and me and everybody else, ready to make us children of God the moment that we decide to stop making God our enemy or being enemies of God. It's only our choice, and it's only on our side that antagonism exists. So the truth is, even if the idea that God is always watching sounds cruel or judgmental, and maybe isn't great for people who are enemies of God, Psalm 121 tells us that it's really anything but. And that because none of us are enemies of God, we really can lean into this more joyful, hopeful version of God watching over us. God's role as a watchman should give us courage, not fear. God's watchfulness means that God is our ever-present help in times of trouble, that God will not abandon us to anyone who chooses to be our enemy. We can not only withstand whatever evil there is in the world, but even be like Jesus. Step out into the midst of violence and chaos with love. Because we know that God is our watchman, protecting and caring for us. Psalm 121 is also a message of hope to us. Courage and hope. The psalmist says that God is with us night and day, never sleeps. So if you feel abandoned or alone, Psalm 121 says that God is there with you, always. And if you see evil in this world, and it seems to be harder and harder to ignore that it's there, and it seems to be coming faster and faster of late, but if you see that evil in the world, and you start to feel despair, then this psalm reminds us that God is still there. God's still watching over all of that. God is still watching, still protecting, still able to stem the tide of evil, turn things towards goodness. It's not out of his control. This world is not a hopeless place because God, the watchman, is there to guide our steps, keep us from slipping into the darkness. So no matter what you go through, no matter who makes themselves your enemy, God is there. God is there to protect you and watch over you in the way that only God can. Because God is a watchman. And because he's a watchman, we can live with the freedom that comes from the knowledge that we are being protected by one who never sleeps, never misses a threat, never lets our feet slip. Far from making us live in fear, God's watchfulness should inspire us to step out into the world and love our enemies and live with a courageous hope. So let's pray together. Let's join in prayer. All right, let's circle it up if we can.